But I got to turn it over to our next panel, which is being run by one of our organizers of today's event. She is a central figure in Latinx studies here at LaGuardia, Dr. Joy Sanchez-Taylor of the English department. Take it away, Dr. Taylor.
Thank you, Hugo. And that was an amazing keynote. Watching Alejandro de la Fuente easily field all of those questions on so many different various areas of Latin American studies, like scholar goals. But as Hugo said, my name is Joy Sanchez-Taylor, and I'm one of the co-chairs along with Dr. Rebecca Talley of our Latinx Heritage Committee here at LaGuardia. That does a lot of the work of Latin American and Latinx studies here. And it's my job and my honor to introduce the first panel of the day, New and Future Directions in Latinx Studies. This panel is going to be an amazing lineup of award-winning Latinx scholars who are adding some amazing and really innovative work to the study of Latinx studies. And we're so happy to have them all speaking here today. So it's my job right now to introduce the moderator of this panel and my honor, Dr. Jillian Báez. Dr. Báez is an associate professor in the Africana and Puerto Rican Latino Studies Department at Hunter College, one of our sister CUNY schools. She's also an affiliated faculty member at the CUNY Mexican Studies Institute and on the doctoral faculty in Women and Gender Studies at the CUNY Graduate Center. Her research expertise lies in Latina, OX, media and popular culture, transnational feminisms, and issues of belonging and citizenship. She's the author of In Search of Belonging, Latinas, Media and Citizenship, and the recipient of the 2019 Bonnie Ritter Award for Outstanding Feminist Book at the National Communication Association. Dr. Báez's research has also been published in numerous peer-reviewed journals, including Critical Studies in Media Communication, Communication, Culture and Critique, Women's Studies Quarterly, Latino Studies, Centro, Journal of the Center for Puerto Rican Studies here at CUNY, and Chicana Latina Studies. So I'm going to now turn it over to Dr. Jillian Báez.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sanchez-Taylor, for such a generous introduction. I am so delighted to be here with all of you on this panel. How this is going to run is I will introduce each panelist right before they go so that you can hear their biographies. We have with us a really, really wonderful group of scholars, and I'm so excited. I would like to go in alphabetical order. So we'll have Dr. Sonia Alejandra Rodríguez go, then we'll have Dr. Gabriela Spears-Rico go, and last but certainly not least, we'll have Dr. Omaris Zamora go. Also, for this particular panel, we have enabled the chat function, so feel free to have conversation there, that's relevant to the panel as we go. And there's also the Q&A function is there as well, also to ask questions that we can then look at during the Q&A period. So first, it is my absolute honor to introduce Sonia Alejandra Rodríguez, who is an associate professor in the English department at LaGuardia Community College here at CUNY, where she teaches composition, literature, and creative writing. She is the recipient of a 2020 Mellon Emerging Faculty Leaders Award presented by the Institute of Citizens and Scholars, formerly known as the Woodrow Wilson Foundation. Dr. Rodríguez received her PhD in English from the Department of English at the University of California, Riverside. Her research introduces what she calls conocimiento narratives as a way to read healing practices within Latinx children's and young adult literature. Dr. Rodríguez's research has been published in the following journals: Children's Literature and Children's Literature and Education, and in the following collections: Mexicanas Fashions, Self-Adornment, Identity Construction, and Political Self-Presentations, and also Voices of Resistance, Essays on Chicano Children's Literature. So when you're ready, go ahead and take it away.
Thank you so much for that presentation. for that introduction. And thank you so much to all of the panelists for being here with me to serve on this panel, and to all the conference organizers. I'm gonna try to share my screen, see if it works. So give me a second. Can y'all see that? Is that?
Yes.
Excellent, thank you so much. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and start it. My presentation for today is titled Undocumented Resistance, Immigration in Latinx Children's and Young Adult Literature. By using the term undocumented resistance, I'm referring to the act of documenting, as in to document, record, archive, register, catalog, to write down the experiences of resistance by undocumented immigrants and by immigrants with what is considered like legal documentation. Additionally, with this term of undocumented resistance, I'm also referring to forms of resistance that go undocumented, as in like off the record or without a trace, again, both by undocumented immigrants and by immigrants like with papers. Undocumented resistance allows me to capture the myriad ways that immigrants resist, both in public and in private, against state-sanctioned violence, both in their home countries and in the United States. I employ this term because in the US, we have two visions of who undocumented immigrants are in particular. They're either the dreamers or the day laborers. In her award-winning book, The Undocumented Americans, Carla Cornejo Villavicencio says, historically, legislators and immigrant advocates have parted the sea of the undocumented with a splintered staff, working brown men and women on one side and academically achieving young brown people on the other. One a parasitic blight, the other heroic dreamers. It is with this parting of the sea mentality that as a country, we've had the introduction of different iterations, for example, of the DREAM Act, or with the introduction in 2012 of DACA, legislations that protect and favor undocumented immigrants who are quote unquote these heroic dreamers. Furthermore, I employ undocumented resistance to challenge existing phrases that further marginalize undocumented immigrants, such as seeing them as voiceless, in particularly around elections, where undocumented immigrants and green card holders can vote in federal or state elections, and as invisible, particularly when referring to their labor. With undocumented resistance, I ask, voiceless to whom and invisible to whom? My research for this project and for this presentation focuses on Latinx children's and young adult literature and immigration as a symptom of US imperialism. Scholar Marilisa Jimenez Garcia says in the introduction of her book, Side by Side, US Empire, Puerto Rico and the Roots of American Youth Literature and Culture, that there has been a hesitancy to view the US as an empire, preferring an immigrant paradigm in locating difference rather than a settler colonial model regarding past and present land acquisition, occupation, removal, and continuous displacement of indigenous populations. Particularly in the case of Latinos, the dominant discourse lingers on issues of immigration and the border rather than seeing the Latinx presence in the US as a quote harvest of empire. As in, we prefer the misnomer that we are a country of immigrants rather than the reality that the US is a country of pillage and genocide. In the publishing industry of children's books, there's been a lot of critique that there are too many books that come out about and by Latinx authors that are about immigrations, as if that's all Latinx communities are. And in one part, I agree. The predominantly white publishing industry has taken immigration stories from Latinx communities as the primary narrative. According to Amy Fish, who writes about Edward Stanticat's Mama's Nightingale, which I'll turn to in a minute, children are seen as the quote ideal subjects of migration, because the exceptionality of the child allows quote white US power to celebrate children as unthreatening, sentimental representations of migration while eliding their social and political worlds, end quote. So in other words, it's possible that by pigeonholing Latinx stories to this like immigrant narrative told through the perspective of the child, the idea is that the story and immigrants become more palatable because children are presumed as innocent. Right? However, as Black, Indigenous, and other communities of color are aware, children of color are never presumed innocent and are certainly not always safe. Instead, I argue that immigration stories should be read as part of this undocumented resistance to archive, record, and bear witness to US imperialism and the effects that it's had on communities of color. I will now quickly discuss 4 children's books that demonstrate different forms of undocumented resistance as an example of what it is that I'm talking about. And I'm gonna go quickly so as to not go over my time. The first book that I want to talk about is Mama's Nightingale, which is a story of immigration and separation by Haitian author Edward Stantecat, which came out in 2015. In Mama's Nightingale, Stantecat tells the story of a Haitian family living in the US. And in the story, the mother is currently in a detention center and the father and the child protagonist, Saya, wait for her release. Saya uses storytelling to deal with her mother's detention and is ultimately this form of storytelling that helps Saya fight for her mother's release. I start with Mama's Nightingale because when we talk about the current border crisis, we cannot erase the thousands of Haitian immigrants currently policed and jailed in Mexico's own versions of detention centers. And in US detention centers, Black immigrants make a significant percentage of that population, right? And they face anti-Blackness discrimination, which leads to longer incarcerations in detention centers and harsher treatment. And I think that with the popular representation of what is happening in the border crisis, the erasure of Black immigrants is very prevalent. In Mama's Nightingale, there are 2 forms of undocumented resistance. There's a public and a private example. The private undocumented resistance consists of Saya listening to her mother's voice on the answering machine, and then listening to her mother's voice on tapes she sends telling Saya's story. So in Mama's Nightingale, even though Saya's mother is in a detention center, she somehow manages to record oral storytelling, like stories in their Haitian tradition, and sends them to Saya. And so Saya every night listens to these stories. And illustrator Leslie Staub here demonstrates the impact of that resistance. And so on my left-hand side, you see the tape recorder and like the literal representation of the mother in green still very present and coming out in like this blue wave, right, which represents the voice, and then overhead, you see the story being told in Creole. So the impact of this resistance, of this like form of what I'm calling undocumented resistance, because it's a private moment, right? As in the mother is privately recording these stories and sending them to Zaya, and Zaya is privately listening them over and over, so much so that she ends up breaking the tape, demonstrates that even though they are being separated by like systemic violence and by these systems of unlike immigration policies and these structures of power, mother and daughter can still remain connected through their Haitian oral storytelling traditions. And on this other page, on my right, if hopefully you can see my mouse, this is an example of the illustrator's Leslie Staub illustrating the mother's storytelling. And so it says, after that visit, they've gone to go visit Saya's mom, a new tape with a new story arrives at the house every week. Sometimes the stories are as sad as melted ice cream. Other times they are as happy as a whole day at the beach. And so what Saya's mother is doing is telling Zaya the stories that the mother grew up hearing from her own mother. And so in this way, we have like this passing on of like traditions, even within a system that is determined to separate them and to marginalize them and to invisibilize them because of who they are. In this other set of illustrations, Saya has taken it upon herself to publicly document her and her family's story in a letter, which will eventually lead to her mother's freedom after a reporter shares the family's story. So up to this point in this picture book, the father is represented as writing letters, petition letters to the court, to public media outlets to get the story so that they can garner attention and eventually release the release of his wife and Saya's mother, but it has not worked. So again, his letter efforts have gone unnoticed. And then eventually Saya picks up this effort of letter writing. And so it says, "Papa, can I write letters too?" I ask. "Of course," he says, "you can write your own story." I take Papa's advice, sit down, and write my own story. According to scholar Amy Fish, Danticat invokes the figure of the exceptional child, not only to complicate it, both honoring the specificity of the young person's narrative and setting it within a, but it will also setting it within a multivocal storytelling world. So in other words, while it's simple to read the story as finding agency only in Saya's experience as a storyteller, it is also important to contextualize her experience within a broader Haitian tradition of storytelling that includes her parents. In this picture book, and when you see in front of you, it is the impact Saya feels when she listens to her mother's story tapes and her father's letter writing. Right, and again, like these are the story tapes, beautifully illustrated by Staub. And it is her father's, her witnessing her father continuing to write these letters that eventually encouraged Saya to speak up in her own manner. So I believe that it is these forms of undocumented resistance that challenge the erasure and marginalization communities of color, and particularly Black immigrants, experience when coming to the United States. The picture book doesn't go into this, but many of the reasons that Haitians leave their country has a lot to do with US intervention on the island, which has led to an increase of violence, poverty, and even issues of climate change. And so again, I use Mama's Nightingale to talk about the ways that to challenge this idea of the exceptional like child migrant as in being isolated without having a context. And here, as Amy Fish tells us, right, Dantica has represented Saya as having her own agency that is grounded within her family and her community, right? That it wasn't done alone. And in this illustration on my right, you see Saya clearly represented, right? Having her own agency, but there's a picture of the family, the dad is there, right? And then the reporter representing that the story is now going public. In Efren Divided, written by Ernesto Cisnero, it's a story about a young Mexican boy in Southern California whose mother is deported after being caught in an immigration raid. So throughout this middle grade novel, Efren is put in adult situations because he and his younger siblings are the citizens in the family. Both the mom and the dad are undocumented. With this book, Cisneros shines a spotlight on the emotional toll of having a mixed status family when the US government is bent on separating families. I highlight this middle grade book as an example of undocumented resistance, particularly because of the ways that like rumors, gossip, and chisme are prevalent as a means of communication in Efren's community. I read the chisme as a form of undocumented resistance that often goes unnoticed or unrecorded because of the very premise that chisme is not real, right? Or that it's not entirely true. However, Efren hears about families getting separated at the US-Mexico border from the news, from his friends, from people around the neighborhood, right? ICE has become an ominous presence in his personal life and in his community. And so it says he'd heard about ICE setting up checkpoints and literally taking people off the street. He'd heard about ICE helicopters carrying people out of their homes and hauling them away. He'd even heard of ICE making stops at Mexican-geared supermarkets and handcuffing anyone who couldn't prove they belonged. Whether the rumors were true or not, they sounded real enough to worry him. And so again, for me, the repetition of he heard, right, these rumors reinforces a sense of undocumented resistance. The the power of chisme in this community as a form of communication is what eventually protects this community and eventually ends up helping Efren learn more about ICE, right? And again, I want to reinforce that chisme here is an exceptional form of undocumented resistance, because it's not as if there are like legal communication. It's not like ICE is telling you, here's a memo and we're going to go raid your place, right? But instead, as many of us are very familiar, there's been this network of like chisme gossip that circulates within Latinx communities or immigrant communities to try to help communities stay safe, right? And that is a form of undocumented resistance. And I just want to emphasize that even though there's power and empowerment in this gossip and chisme, Efren is still a 12-year-old child, right, who was being traumatized by the constant fear that ICE is perpetrating on his community. Efren doesn't know if ICE is in fact real or not, if it's arresting people, but he knows enough from what he is hearing from the fear in his community to know that they are a threat. So at 12 years old, as a child, he knows enough about systemic powers and the ways it's abused to know that he doesn't need to see the separation of families to know that it is real. So again, with chisme, even if not entirely true, there's enough evidence to suggest, right, that there's enough truth to be worried about it. And the last book that I'll talk about very quickly, because I feel like I'm running out of time, is Caravan to the North, Misael's Long Walk, written by Jorge Argueta. And it's a story in verse following Misael's migration journey from El Salvador to the US-Mexico border. And I read undocumented resistance in this book in two ways. First, because Misael speaks about the violence in his neighborhood back in El Salvador. And again, while these children's books like talk about immigration, they never directly mention like US imperialism. Like there's very rarely a book that talks about we're migrating because of the intervention of the US in this country, in their Latin American country. But while there is no direct blaming of the US for the intervention in Central America that led to a civil war, that led to more violence and poverty, that is in fact why many Central Americans have been caravanning to the US to seek asylum. And Misael, in his own poems, or in the tellings of these poems, captures that experience. Second, popular understandings of immigration to the US paints the US as a place where the streets are paved with gold and is the best place in the world, right? And that this idealized representations of the US, again, are due to imperialism, which Hollywood has a lot to do with, but that's a different presentation. In Caravan to the North, Misael often talks about how much he loves his country and his neighborhood, and how leaving was not by choice, but out of necessity. And so I want to point to very quickly to two poems, right? The first one, Misael documenting, right, this undocumented resistance, bearing witness to the violence in his neighborhood and the reason for why he had to leave. And it's one of the opening poems. He says, "My name is Misael Martinez. I've come to join the caravan that's leaving tomorrow from Plaza Divino Salvador del Mundo to the north. I'm going with my family. We decided to leave because you can't really live in my village anymore. There's no work, there's no way to get by. What there is violence and gangs." And there are several other poems in this collection where Misael is bearing witness to his fellow caravan goers for the reasons that they are leaving. And what they have in common is, again, like the incessant violence in these neighborhoods that, again, when you think of this violence, you cannot separate from like the US intervention, right? They go hand in hand, right? The violence is present because of the role that the United States played in like the Central American like civil wars. And the second example of like this undocumented experience, undocumented resistance, where Misael is challenging this notion of the streets paved with gold and USA #1, is where he talks about how much he loved this country. And it says, "I love my country so much. I love to plant the fields, see the corn come up and the little beans sprout. Every year in May, my whole family gets the land ready for planting. We do the weeding, fertilizing. We pray for a good crop. We get up before sunrise. We feel happy when we put the beans and the corn in Mother Earth." And so just as we see with Saya and Mama's Nightingale and Efren Divided, it's easy to read Misael's story as an individual agency, right? Or read him as the exceptional child as having all the power. But again, throughout this text, it's Misael who is bearing witness to all his fellow caravan travelers, right? Forcing us as readers to also bear witness to their stories and experiences. And in doing so, I feel like there's this other form of undocumented resistance where the protagonist and the point of view is forcing the readers to participate in this resistance. So here's my works cited. And in this very quick presentation, I talked about undocumented resistance in children's books and the ways that this undocumented resistance challenges US imperialism. So thank you so much. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and listen to my other presentations.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rodríguez. I'm unable to start my video, but I'm here. And I think we're not allowed to turn them on is what it is. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and introduce our next guest, who is Dr. Gabriela Spears-Rico. She is a Pirinda Purepecha Indigenous feminist poet and scholar who serves as an assistant professor of Chicano, Latino Studies, and American Indian Studies at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities. Her research explores how representations of indigeneity in Mexican popular culture inform understandings of race and ethnicity among people of Mexican descent. Dr. Spears-Rico is currently working on her first book, Mestizo Melancholia and the Legacy of Conquest in Michoacán, which offers an ethnographic analysis of the Days of the Dead to examine how quote unquote going native functions in Mexico. Through her concept of mestizo melancholia, she is interested in unraveling how acts of mourning and cultural appropriation reveal the technologies of mestizaje. She authored, open quote, Decolonial Purepecha Maternalista Motherwork as Pedagogy, end quote, in the Chicana Motherwork Anthology, which was published by the University of Arizona Press in 2019. And open quote, In the Time of War and Hashtags, Rehumanizing Indigeneity in the Digital Landscape, end quote, in Indigenous Interfaces, both published last year by the University of Arizona Press. Her scholarship has been featured on Native America Calling and Indigeneity Rising, as well as in Latinx Talk. She is a Mellon Mays Fellow and a Woodrow Wilson Fellow, and was recently awarded a fellowship from the Institute of Advanced Study at the University of Minnesota. Welcome so much, Dr. Spears-Rico.
Thank you so much. I'm really happy to join you today. And I want to start by acknowledging that I am joining you from the land of the Osheti-Sacoan people, Dakota Territory here in Minnesota, in St. Paul, Minnesota. And I also want to start by acknowledging the tremendous week that we have had here in the Twin Cities. 2 weeks really of a continuing uprising by the Black Lives Matter movement. As an Indigenous feminist anthropologist, I stand against all forms of violence, of intersectional violence, especially racialized violence. And so I want to acknowledge, that we've also been living through an ongoing uprising here that I fully support. I want to thank the organizers at LaGuardia, especially Dr. Sanchez-Taylor for inviting me, and my longtime colega and friend, Dr. Báez as well, for having me. I'm going to start my timer here and attempt to share my screen. The title of my lecture today is The Colonial Nostalgia of Mestizaje and an Indigenous Critique of Latinidad. And I'm going to be just giving a layout of what my lecture is going to look like. I want to start by saying that some of this is going to be historical contextualization, because I read that we have both high school and college students joining us today. So I just want to ensure that, we're on the same page in terms of how I'm thinking about Mestizaje historically, and how I'm thinking about Latinidad, and how we're thinking about it really in our Critical Latinx Indigeneities working group, which is based out of UCLA, but includes scholars throughout the country and throughout the Americas. So I will start by laying out an understanding of Mestizaje as a state project, specifically as it emerges in Mexico, which is where my anthropological work has been based. Secondly, I will cover the critique of the construct of Mestizaje within Chicano studies specifically, which is the field where I teach and where I also have formation as a scholar. Thirdly, I'm going to cover my own intervention in this work of mestizo melancolia as my concept that emerges from theory developed through my anthropological work, ethnographic work specifically in the Pátzcuaro Basin of Michoacán, Mexico. And fourthly, I'm going to give an overview of what the critical Latinx indigeneities critique is of Latinidad and of Mestizaje, as what Josie Saldaña Negrete has termed a paradigm drift in Latino studies. So for me, there are four major moments where Mestizaje emerges as a nationalist project that I will very briefly give coverage to in this presentation. The first one is the rape of La Malinche that I am in conversation with Octavio Paz, and really critiquing also how Mexican scholars and intellectuals have been thinking about the rape of La Malinche, and how we as Mexicans have, have identified from that moment on in terms of what our nationalist project has looked like. Secondly, the colonial period, and specifically el sistema de las castas, and how that emerges from there. Fourthly, thirdly, the Mexican Revolution, and how Mestizaje emerges as a nationalist construct from the Mexican Revolution, both in terms of policies that are developed from indigenismo and in terms of ideology. And fourthly, the critique of the Chicano movement, also how it reinforces a nationalist project as we know it here, in terms of thinking about Greater Mexico and Mexican heritage identity in the United States. So a brief overview of La Malinche, which I'm sure, for the scholars that are joining us is definitely, knowledge that you already have, but I want to, provide this context nonetheless for folks that may not be as familiar. So she was the daughter of a Nahua cacique from the Mexican Gulf Coast. She was actually very educated and was a royal, but when her father died, she was traded to a cacique in Tabasco. Indigenous women in Mesoamerican societies often seal diplomatic agreements, as they did in Native North America. And she was also then again given to Hernán Cortés, as basically a slave. She became the link between Cortés and Moctezuma by translating between Chontal and Nahuatl for Cortés that ended up facilitating what we know as a conquest of Tenochtitlan now. This was a very unequal relationship dynamic, as we can imagine. She became his mistress, and I'm sure that, there was agency in how she managed. Well, I know that there was agency in how she managed that particular situation. And she birthed Martín Cortés, who in Mexican popular culture is now known as the first mestizo. The truth is that actually, as Chicana feminists have affirmed, she has had agency. She was an extremely intelligent woman. How quickly she learned Spanish, is completely impressive. And we also see her agency emerge from how she negotiated her marriage towards the end of her relationship with Cortés. In order to continue to help him, she asked to marry a Spaniard because she knew that then that would give her land owning stature, and that it would also allow her to ask for an hacienda as a wedding present, an encomienda, and she asked for that encomienda in Otula, which was her homeland, to become the ruler and protector of her own people, of where the region where she was born. Today, of course, La Malinche is still a polemical figure in Mexican popular culture. She's regurgitated always as a traitor. What we know, what we have as Malinchismo, as somebody who basically is a traitor to the nation. And Malinchistas can be anything from Mexican presidents to Mexican feminists for being traitors to Mexican nationalism, basically. La Chingada is another way that she's known popularly, and of course Octavio Paz theorizes this heavily in his work as far as how Mexicans have, according to him, this inferiority complex because we come from the raped one, or from La Chingada. And as I mentioned before, there's been a reclamation among Mexican feminists and among Chicana feminists that she was actually a cultural broker and an intermediary, and perhaps even saved more indigenous lives who would otherwise have perished as a result of the conquest. Secondly, very quickly, to think about the sistema de castas and the way that it reproduces mestizaje, there were various forms for social categorization during colonial Mexico. There was a great anxiety among the Spanish heritage population once racial mixing began, because Mexico, as we know in Latin America, was more open to miscegenation with the indigenous population, as well as with kidnapped African slaves. So we have the casta system that emerges in terms of these categorization, a very complex system, as we see from the archive that we have in the casta paintings, some of which I'm showing here, based on the concept of limpieza de sangre, or purity of blood, which was basically how much Christian blood a person had in their genetics in order to be considered pure, as well as other complex social relationships, like, for example, socioeconomic background, and being considered a gente de razón, somebody who lived and worked in the city, versus a gente sin razón, somebody who was considered a plebeian, or from the more rural areas, being considered a persona decente, having calidad, having quality, and basically how that was also related to the concept of purity of blood. So we have this very complex system of numerous racial categories. I'm just kind of, providing these two graphics here. I'm happy to share, my lecture, with folks who requested over email, and then you can kind of, delve into it in more detail yourself in terms of what the hierarchy looked like, as well as what the 16 racial categories look like from the casta system. The other historical moment that for me also establishes mestizaje in Mexican popular culture is the Mexican War of Independence. And of course, we know that after 281 years of mercantilism, a very extractive economic relationship between the Spanish colonial power and Mexico, as a country, criollos and mestizos were very angry and frustrated at being ruled by mainland Spain. So we have this figure that emerges from Father Miguel Hidalgo in 1810, gives the Grito de Dolores in Guanajuato, and it becomes a very pivotal moment for the Mexican Revolution. He was actually then, killed very quickly, but then he became the symbol of, of the fight for Mexican independence. What is less known is that the army was actually 50% indigenous, and that there was a large Afro-Mexican contingent from the Costa Chica that included Jose Maria Morelos, who went on to, become an extraordinary historical figure in Mexican history as well. And it ends in 1821, and it really births what we know as Mexican nationalism now. We don't often learn about the influential roles of Afro-Mexican revolutionaries like Jose Maria Morelos, Juan Alvarez, or Vicente Guerrero, who went on to become the first really Afro-Mexican president in the continent, and who abolished slavery in 1829. And I think the reason for that is because we have this light-skinned mestizo figure who is also, a father, Miguel Hidalgo, and his banner of La Virgen de Guadalupe. Those are the popular symbols that, regurgitate or reproduce, is a better word, reproduce mestizaje for the Mexican, popular imaginary to identify with. After the War of Independence, there is the period of the Porfiriato, the Porfirio Diaz was incredibly anti-Indigenous, both in terms of ideology and in practice. He not only was, sort of like self-hating and, choosing to call himself Latin and choosing to whiten his own skin, but he also implemented the latifundo land ownership structure, which privatized huge acreage of lands and led to an incredible amount of wealth inequality in Mexico. So just, here's one stat: by 1910, only 2% of the population held titles to the land, and only 10% of indigenous communities held land by the end of the Porfiriato. This leads to the period of Reconstruction after the Mexican, or it leads to the Mexican Revolution, who folks are probably more familiar with, where we have, the mythological figures and real historical figures of Pancho Villa in the north and Emiliano Zapata in the south. This uprising to establish a democratic government, basically, and to oust the Porfiriato. What happens, though, I think, because I think about Zapata as such a historical figure he was an indigenous man. He was from a Nahua community, specifically. But what happens is good in terms of land redistribution through the ejido system, which grants landless peasants like my indigenous peasants like my grandparents land within an ejido. But then also at the same time leads to this period of Reconstruction that calls for national unity and unfortunately results in reproducing mestizaje as a national construct of identity. And what that looked like in practice, what this period of Reconstruction looked like in practice, which was really informed by Mexican intellectual Jose Vasconcelos and also by policymakers like Manuel Gamio. This was definitely an assimilationist time during which indigenous people were forced to Mexicanize for the sake of the government's post-revolution nation building project. Jose Vasconcelos himself, has this concept of la raza cósmica, or the cosmic race. Within the concept, if you read La Raza Cósmica, which is sort of his manifesto, he talks about how mestizos are made up of the best genetic material, the best genetic qualities from each racial group. However, his actual philosophies and what he argues is very racist. If you take a close analysis at even the introduction of the manifesto, where he is attributing the more central and bodily contributions to mestizaje to African and indigenous people, and in attributing intellectual contributions to Spanish or European roots. The Mexican government unfortunately adopts Vasconcelos' theory of la raza cósmica without any sort of critical thought into what this means for, erasing and or promoting the assimilation of indigenous folks and of Afro-descendants in Mexico. So in terms of what does the Mestizaje as a state project look like, after all of this? So we continue to reproduce Tenochtitlan as an origin story for all Mexicans, which erases the 60, remaining, more than 60 remaining indigenous groups and languages in Mexico, who we all have different origin stories. There's an adoption of the Spanish language as the national language and an active campaign to eliminate indigenous languages. There's a call for the assimilation of Western values that are derived from Hispanic influences specifically, and material and intellectual manifestations of Westernized culture, and a codifying or rearticulating moment of violent rape, as the violent rape of indigenous women and of African women as actually a harmonious birthing of mestizos. So we can think about Vasconcelos' legacy and how ingrained it is in Mexican popular thought, but by just thinking about, for example, the way that we acknowledge El Día de la Raza, how Columbus Day becomes El Día de la Raza, the day to celebrate mestizaje, the birth of the race. And this, this basically acknowledges that the history of the Americas begins with Columbus's arrival, and that this is who we are as a people, a mixed race, and I really encourage folks to think critically about what that means in terms of reconsidering, for example, even the word la raza as a colonial construct. And I know that it has new meanings, you know, in Mexican popular usage, it's really, you know, meant to be the people, or meant to be the working class as a unifying, you know, rally or call for movement. But at the same time, it does have this origin with Vasconcelos, and it has this origin with Christopher Columbus, and promotes also the erasure of indigenous folks and languages and Mexico, as well as of Afro-descendant experiences. Within the Chicano movement, I have a couple of slides here once again that I'm happy to share so that you can read them in more detail. There is a very real reason, right, for the Chicano movement as an uprising, you know, and everything from lynchings that start with the Texas Rangers in the Southwest, that are very, you know, like hundreds of Mexicans were actually lynched in the Southwest, and that history isn't known as much. The segregation of neighborhoods, the Greaser Acts, et cetera. So I want to acknowledge that that, you know, the Chicano movement arises from in this incredible political moment of the 1960s with a very real need to declare, you know, to declare a movement for Mexican heritage people to fight for their rights. However, in terms of the way that it articulates indigeneity, it's actually quite problematic because it reproduces, you know, some of these problematic erasures that happen due to relying on Vasconcelos with the concept of la raza, as well as this romanticizing of indigeneity that is entirely Mexica-centric as it emerges in the 60s in the Chicano movement. We read about it in El Plan de Espiritual Daslan, and the very popular rallying cry in the poem by Luis Valdés, Daniel Valdés, and Corky González, Yo Soy Joaquín, and continues to be reproduced even after that into the 1980s and into the 1990s, and even today. You know, so we have these appropriations that of Mexica culture and Mexica philosophy and thought that start happening in the 1960s to define the way that we think about ourselves as Mexican Americans here in the United States. And in doing so, there's this contradiction that's really reproduced that glorifies indigenous people of the past and ignores indigenous people of today. So these are the major critiques of, you know, that particular moment, some of which have been addressed by scholars, for example, like Gloria Ansaldúa. So the reliance on La Raza and Mestizaje, reproducing nationalism that silenced indigenous people and Afro-descendants, the silencing of women through malinchismo of Chicana feminists that began really in the 1960s, as well as the homophobia in the movement. I think that there's been a better addressing and critiques that we have seen over time of the last two of these. The silencing of Chicana women with Chicana feminists, you know, really being vociferous in those critiques of the Chicano movement, and starting an entire intellectual tradition, you know, that I also, you know, connect myself to as a woman of Mexican descent here in the United States, and as well as of the homophobia. So we have these scholars, you know, that do a wonderful job of offering those critiques and of changing the paradigms in Chicano studies. Through Chicana feminist critiques like Gloria Ansaldúa and like Shireen Moraga, but they also continue these appropriations of indigeneity that are quite problematic, and continue to, you know, be very Mexica-centric in their thought about the philosophies of indigeneity, that we have quite a diversity of in Mexico, and, you know, reproduce some of these silences. The critique and intervention that I offer with my concept of mestizo melancholia is, you know, I'm thinking about what I witnessed in my field work of over 10 years, a period of 10 years in Michoacan, studying mestizo tourists specifically, having an urgent desire to experience indigenous people and our traditions in their purest forms, you know, whatever that may mean to folks. It stems from the impulsive, you know, Mexican desire to understand the era of the before, the era of divinities, goddesses, intellectual sophistication, you know, great civilizations, etc. But it continues to promote the idea that indigenous people, contemporary indigenous people, don't have a political agenda or agency. I witnessed this in the field, and I'll give you some examples. very, very quickly because I know that I'm running out of time. This concept acknowledges that Mexican mestizos of indigenous heritage are tribalized, orphan indigenous people seeking answers, but also that they're complicit in indigenous marginalization and touristic commodification. So just to give you some examples from the field as they emerge, this is Monica, who's an attorney from Puerto Vallarta. If they become integrated into society, they will not belong anymore. I know it's a challenge for modern society to access these communities. They live in really, for really hard conditions, but you think, what is best for them? It's best for them actually to remain isolated and poor. So she really romanticizes authenticity and attaches it to poverty, because then at least that they will remain pure. Armando, who's a journalist from DF, who I interviewed, talks about how he hopes the simplicity will continue to be preserved for the best of these communities. So much progress for them is not good. It's not good for indigenous people to desire, modern amenities, for example, like washing machines or houses that are not made out of adobe. Before that progress and was was good for the development projects to exist. But in reality, that's not true. So it's better for them to keep their life simple. So this is where I really witness a lot of that mestizo melancholia for indigeneity and what it's supposed to look like according to these mestizo tourists. However, purépechas offer a really strong critique of mestizaje in my interviews, where they talk about mestizos as really broken people that are lost, and purépechas as ambacati people who are really grounded in our values and are grounded in our communities, that we consider ourselves whole because we still are, dwelling in our homelands, plus the diaspora. Obviously, there's been a migration after NAFTA as well. But really viewing mestizos as culturally and spiritually lost people. And I'll give you an example from the field in a second, and how despite their visits to Michoacan, during spiritual events like the Days of the Dead, mestizos remain culturally astray because they return to their daily lives in the cities and continue to live by westernized cultural norms. So to end here, I'll give you this example from Tata Ruben, who identified himself as an hombre medicina, or a medicine man. And he says mestizos do not have a very rooted ideology. They don't have nature. They come looking for nature in our lakes and in our mountains, but they don't really understand them because they still have this mentality, that is foreign to indigeneity. They come here for a few days to try to learn about being indigenous, but they don't really know the way of the eagle. They cannot understand our Purépecha cosmology, so they return to their lives in the cities, and they continue being influenced by Europeanized standards, and so they're really lost people, is what he said. Poor mestizos, poor mestizaje. Just to end here, this is my last slide and contribution today. This is a picture of us at an Indigenous Studies conference that happened in San Diego last year, right before the pandemic. This is sort of the Purépecha Michoacan Indigenous Studies contingent that was there, the panel that we put together. But to give you an overview of the interventions that we are making in this critical thinking of Latinidad, from a critical Latinx indigeneity's perspective. We reject the call to be assimilated into Latinidad. We call into question mestizaje as a colonial construct that manifests privilege and executes erasures. It engages with the mestizo search for indigeneity as mourning, which is where my work comes in the work of Saldaña and Cotera, and it calls out anti-indigenous racism among Latinos here in the United States. For example, racism, there's been a scholarship on racism in schooling as experienced by indigenous students. And it engages with critical intersectionalities within the Latin American indigenous experience, indigenous migrant experience in the United States, such as gendered oppression as it appears in the work of Shannon Speed and Flori Boch Lopez. And then this concept of multiple colonialities that really speaks differently to our experiences and as indigenous folks here in the United States, as different from mestizos, where we experience the coloniality in Mexico of being indigenous, indigenous folks that are displaced, the coloniality of migration, and then the coloniality of experiencing racism at the hands of mestizos. And just lastly, to acknowledge also Afro-descendant interventions that are also happening, desegregating a race within Latinidad absolutely matters. Black Lives Matter. And I encourage you all to check out the work of the Black Latinas No Collective. I have the website there as well to engage more with what some of those critiques are, because I think that they're really in conversation with critical Latinx indigeneity too. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Spears-Rico. We have our last presenter, last but not least. With us is Omaris Zamora, who is an assistant professor of Afro-Latinx studies at Rutgers University, New Brunswick. She is jointly appointed in the Department of Latino and Caribbean Studies and the Africana Studies Department. Dr. Zamora is a transnational Black Dominican Studies scholar and spoken word poet. Her research interests include theorizing Afro-Latinidad in the context of race, gender, and sexuality through Afro-diasporic approaches. Her current book project is tentatively titled Ciguapa Unbound, Afro-Latina Feminist Epistemologies of Transformation. And it examines the transnational Black Dominican narratives put forth in the work of Firelei Báez, Elizabeth Acevedo, Nelly Rosario, Ana Lara, Loida Maritza Perez, Josefina Báez, Cardi B, and La Bella Chanel. Zamora pays close attention to how they embody their Blackness, produce knowledge, and shift the geographies of Black feminism in ways that recognize the legacies of Chicana/Latina and Black American feminist theory in the United States, but tends to the specific experiences of Afro-Latina women and their multiple genealogies. She fuses her poetry with her scholarly work as a way of contributing to a Black poetic approach to literature and cultural studies. Her work has been published in Post 45, Latinx Talk, Label Me Latina Latino, among others, and has been featured on NPR's Alt Latino podcast. Dr. Zamora is the 2020 to 21 Miriam Jimenez Roman Afro-Latinx Fellow at the Latinx Project at New York University. Go ahead and take it away when you're ready, Dr. Zamora. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Jillian, and thank you to all the panelists that went. Those were fabulous presentations, and I can't wait to get to the Q&A. I'm presenting today a bit of the framework for my book, and just also there's a few things in here that are a little more questions than answers, especially towards the end. A few images to share, so I'll start sharing my screen briefly, and I'll be ending with some poetry. Share my screen here. Okay, can everybody see that? If I can get at least one person to say yes.
No.
No? Oh no. Okay. Oh wait, I didn't start sharing my screen. Duh. I haven't had coffee yet, y'all. Here we go. Okay. How about now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Awesome. I'll start my timer here. Ciguapa Unbound, Afro-Latina Feminist Fugitivities. In Dominican popular culture, La Ciguapa is generally described as a nude indigenous woman who has very long hair and backward feet, who looms in the darkness of the mountains and near rivers in Dominican Republic as well as other Caribbean islands. And I'll get to this in a second about other Caribbean islands where you'll hear of La Ciguapa. She is supernatural, timid, and cannot speak, but instead makes a sound of a bird. She can hypnotize and kidnap the men that fall for her song. They will disappear after she's casted her spell on them. It is said that you are more likely to see a Ciguapa during the new moon walking near the rivers. One could only catch a Ciguapa during the full moon using a 5-fingered brown spotted dog, but she is unattainable since the moment she is captured, she is overwhelmed with such sadness that she dies. La Ciguapa's official origin story in the Dominican Republic was written and published by Francisco Javier Angulo Guridi in 1866, a white Criollo Dominican man. It's a folktale story that takes place in El Cibao when Jacinto's dream of marrying his campesina fiancée, Marcelina, gets interrupted by La Ciguapa, who kills Marcelina. The tale is one told from Jacinto's viewpoint to a fellow traveler along the Cibao roads. It's a tale of caution to men who travel through these lands. La Ciguapa, as Janetta Candelario, along with Caribbean literary scholar Giselle Anatole and Kenitra Brooks would agree, is depicted as a figure of threat. However, many writers like Elizabeth Acevedo, Fidele Báez, a visual artist, and Josefina Báez, a performance artist and writer, have re-envisioned La Ciguapa as a divine and empowering figure. They have expanded our collective thinking and engagement of her with themes that range from Black diasporic feminisms, the archive, transnational tropical landscapes, colonialism then and now, as well as fugitivity. I read La Ciguapa as a figurative portal opener into the trance. La Ciguapa's unboundedness, her strange embodiment with backward-facing feet, her connection to the forest, her refusal to be enclosed is a framework for transnational Afro-Dominican women's experiences of geographical movement, as well as the fluidity of our identities as their constant transformation to the point that it is at times illegible, unattainable, and untraceable. La Ciguapa's untrackable movement allows us to understand transformation, or what I call transformation, TRANCE, as an Afro-Latina feminist praxis that is fugitive from the oppressive, stagnant narratives that attempt to enclose us, patriarchy, the prison industrial complex, white supremacy, and many other things. I expand on this notion of Ciguapa Unbound by looking at how Afro-Dominican visual artist Fidele Báez, in this particular presentation, her Ciguapa series, allows us to think of movement, legibility, illegibility, femininity, and groundedness. This presentation discusses how the critical fabulations offered by, a concept offered by Sadia Hartman, of her story, right, of the Ciguapa story, allow us to grapple with the erasure of Blackness through the Indigenista Mestizaje in the Dominican context, as well as the transnational geographies of the Black Anthropocene she inhabits. La Ciguapa story is one of rebellion and marronage, grappling with and surviving in the colonial post-apocalypse. She opens the portal of trance into other worlds for us to see how Black Dominican women culture producers are theorizing transformation in the ways that I delineate in other parts of my work. It is important to engage the critical lens that other scholars offer in revisiting La Ciguapa story. Ginera Candelario's article, La Ciguapa y el Ciguapeo, provides some of the historical and political context necessary to my own questions of La Ciguapa's racialization and the context in which Angulo Guridi is writing in. Candelario reminds us that the narrator, Jacinto, desires to leave the Santo Domingo of the 1860s for a still colonized Spanish Cuba. After La Ciguapa kills his beloved Marcelina, and I quote, ending his dream of marriage and family formation, end quote, for Candelario, La Ciguapa, and I quote, unsettles the promise of racial progress even in the Cibao, end quote. Candelario approaches La Ciguapa as myth, metaphor, and method. For her, La Ciguapa is representative of Dominican contradiction, progression, and regression, of a way of understanding the colonial, imperial, political, and historical positioning of the Dominican Republic. Please excuse my dogs in the background. When you place the historical context in which Guridi's La Ciguapa is published, I'm going to pause for a second. Okay, there you go. Where did I leave off? When you place the historical context in which Guridi's La Ciguapa is published in side by side with the story itself, we can make the claim that Jacinto's desire for going to a still colonized Spanish Cuba was similar to Angulo Guridi's family's own departure to Cuba prior to his writing of La Ciguapa. Angulo Guridi was a writer and journalist born in Dominican Republic to white Spanish parents. Like him, his father was also in the military and moved his family to Cuba when Angulo Guridi was a child. Angulo Guridi returned to Dominican Republic to fight in the War of Restoration against Spain, and as a young man and later died in San Pedro de Macorís, which is an important city for the sugar industry in the late 1800s, as historian April Mays reminds us in her book, The Mulatto Republic, Class, Race, and Dominican National Identity. Mace's book provides us with a unique look into the place of race and the construction of Dominicanidad before the turn of the 20th century as tied to Haiti, Hispanismo, and class. Angulo Guridi writes La Ciguapa in the context of the post-occupation of Haiti and after the Dominican Republic's independence from it. Mays reminds us of the ways that Blackness and racial mixture discourses were used to create and instill Dominicanidad as antithetical to Haiti, Spain, and the United States. In other words, the indigenismo that Angulo Guridi, as well as others, stake a claim for is rooted in racial miscegenation as a way of grounding Dominican national identity. This is similar to other Latin American and Caribbean patriotas of his time, right? And a bit later, like Jose Martí, Jose Vasconcelos, Domingo Sarmiento, etc. Contemporarily, he's also recognized as such by newspapers like Hoy, which is a Dominican newspaper, which portray him as establishing many Dominican firsts. first geography published, first book of verses, creator in Latin America of indigenous literatures, and first Dominican published novel. Through the upholding of the Hispanismo and Hispanidad that Mace describes in her book, intellectuals like Angulo Guridi upheld anti-Blackness. In other words, to be racially mixed, to uphold an Hispanidad that is Dominican, it means that if you are culturally white, you cannot be racially Black. In other words, anti-Blackness is not only anti-Haitian, but the anti-Blackness also comes out in the using of mestizaje, indigenizing politics of the national identity that Dominican is anything but Black. It is very Vasconcilian in the sense that there is a mixture of identity between Spanish and indigenous that returns to the love of land and nation is to acknowledge its indigenous roots as part of the National Pride Project and to be set as an antithesis of the neighboring Black Republic, Haiti. To that end, what does it mean for white criollos to use indigeneity as an antithesis of Blackness? To pin them up against each other as a method of nation building, a Latin American Caribbean nation. Angulo Guridi's indigenista rhetoric and gestures of mestizaje in favor of building Dominican national identity are an example of what Aníbal Quijano calls the coloniality of power, right? In the genealogy of Spanish Empire that's inherently right in that discourse. Given this context, we can begin to think of Angulo Guridi's haunting and threatening figure of La Ciguapa, not as indigenous, but as a Black feminine figure. Indigeneity was not used as a way of actually highlighting the previous native indigenous groups of the island, but in the rhetoric of racial miscegenation and hence Dominican national identity formation. It is the presence of Blackness that is antithetical to the nation state. Interestingly, La Ciguapa is not unique to the Dominican Republic, as Candelario and literary critic Emilio Rodríguez points out in its presence in Cuba. In particular, and I quote, La Ciguapa is also the name of a town in Cuba's Oriental region, the locus of anti-colonial and anti-slavery resistance and rebellion on the island, end quote. It is no coincidence the intersections at which the rebellion of enslaved Black people meets animalistic descriptions, meets indigenization of such creations, meets Angulo Guridi's fictional story of La Ciguapa, who threatens the dreams of the white Dominican campesino who wants to fulfill his dream of national belonging via the patriarchal tradition of marriage and family bearing. We must also think of the Caribbean transnationally and not in isolation. It is no coincidence that in 2013, during my time in the Dominican Republic conducting research at the Biblioteca Nacional Pedro Enrique Jureña, archivists there were in conversation with archivists in Cuba, trying to get back the original official document of the Dominican Republic's independence from Spain. The document was in Cuba, so how to get there? Cuba was still colonized by Spain when the Dominican Republic got its independence from them. The anti-Blackness travels. The approaches to building national identities in Latin America and the Caribbean travel, and so do images and symbols and meanings that carry over, like La Ciguapa, also travel. La Ciguapa in Cuba is imagined by white criollos and moving between Cuba and Dominican Republic alike in a moment of Spanish Empire, fugitivity, marronage, Black rebellion, and the fight for freedom. Emilio Rodríguez, I don't know where, ahí va. Emilio Rodríguez shares further evidence that Ciguapa can be read as a Black figure and shares a lecture from Dominican writer and literary critic Tomás Hernández Franco in his lecture from 1978, where he states that the time of La Ciguapa was a time of mestizaje building where Cibaeños painted themselves mestizo, white, indigenous, or white. The Cibao region has been thought of as a white or non-Black Dominican space, yet we forget that the Cibao is Black too, despite its construction and historical investment in whiteness and capital. As many of these scholars and literary critics have demonstrated, La Ciguapa is indeed a figure of contradiction. Ghosting and the suppression of Black freedom is definitely part of her story and of the Cibao that many claim as white and or non-Black as a non-Black territory. She is a maroon, a rebel living in las montañas del Cibao, a woman whose body has been intimate with colonial harm. Her body lays at the fault lines of the tectonic plates that hold up El Pico Duarte, the highest mountain peak that happens to also be a dividing line between San Juan and Santiago, or El Sur, a space generally understood as predominantly Black, and El Norte Cibaeño, a space generally understood as predominantly white, light-skinned or non-Black in the Dominican Republic. It is no surprise that Cibao was the native name for the island during the Spanish conquest. It was used to refer to the fertile and wealth-producing land between the central and north mountain ranges. Contemporarily, two of the major mines of gold and nickel, the biggest mining and geologic products of the country, are in this region. Pueblo Viejo, which is a gold mine, and Falcondo, which is a nickel mine, right, which is in Bonao, also known as, they also call it Falcon Beach Dominicana. As much as we want to disregard La Ciguapa, paying attention to her allows us to reflect on Blackness, gender, the geographies of Blackness and its movement, and the archives on which fabulations are created. When we arrive to the critical fabulation that is La Ciguapa, we're really talking about the masking of Blackness. La Ciguapa is produced as a pseudo-human threat to the white heteropatriarchal project of national identity that attempts to solidify the nation as non-Black and unassociated with Haiti. La Ciguapa is the end-all be-all who unsettles the promise of racial progress. She is the interruption of Jacinto's dream. She is the threat, but she is also a result of colonialism and the coloniality of power. In this talk, I'm focusing not on a direct tracing of La Ciguapa myth to any original source. Instead, I'm trying to offer a multitude of thought to engage, situate, and imagine the complicated web or relations and interactions, intimacies in and with fugitivity, marronage, kinship, and human extraction, which I don't go into much of the extraction piece here, but I do in the book. As I have delineated here, there was a moment that served to delineate, mixed racial pride, right, and indigeneity as central to that, in order to establish a national identity that was anti-European, anti-European empire, and also anti-US empire, and anti-Black. She is a figure of horror. La Ciguapa is a figure of horror in visual and literary narratives created by white criollos like writer Angelo Guridi. And later on, like in this image, we have visual artist Jaime Colson, who paints the first known visual iteration of La Ciguapa in Dominican Republic. Janet Candelara's provocation of La Ciguapa's emergence in a transnational Dominican diaspora is what I'm interested in contributing to this dialogue, as well as the way that Black Dominican women in the diaspora have taken up La Ciguapa as a figure that contradicts that of Guridi's and critically fabulate her identity as a Black woman is what I want to pay close attention to. And of course, in this talk, I'm only focusing on Fidel Báez's work. I initially returned to the folktale of La Ciguapa through Fidel Báez's Ciguapa series artworks, which challenged my previous understanding of La Ciguapa's identity and the role of her story. What would it mean to explore La Ciguapa as a post-apocalyptic superhero figure who is trying to tell us something? Are we truly listening to the superhero X-Men-like mutant who is using her hypnotizing powers that create a trance? La Ciguapa is a portal opener. It is only up to us to do our due diligence and walk through these portals that invite us into a trance that becomes a space and tool for transformation as it pertains to the lives of Black Caribbean women in the diaspora. I argue that if we watch and listen through the work of Fidel Báez's Ciguapas, we may linger in the possibilities that exist in such a story that colonialism, heteropatriarchy, and white supremacy have rendered impossible, or as Saidiya Hartman would write, a critical fabulation. Similar to Hartman's approach to her article, Venus in Two Acts, La Ciguapa also exists in two acts. The first act of La Ciguapa is the one who haunts, not just the present, but also the colonial and post-colonial. This is Guridi's Ciguapa, or the Ciguapa of the primary archive, if we can call it that. And then there's the second act, La Ciguapa that resists being a disposable life through the reclaiming and recentering of her agency in Fidel Báez's work, through a critical fabulation itself in her work. The method of Hartman's critical fabulation is to tell an impossible story. She writes, and I quote, "Is it possible to exceed or negotiate the constitutive limits of the archive? By advancing a series of speculative arguments and exploiting the capacities of the subjunctive, and fashioning a narrative which is based upon archival research, and by that I mean a critical reading of the archive that mimes the figurative dimensions of history, I intended both to tell an impossible story and to amplify the impossibility of its telling," end quote. Pausing to meditate and reflect of the possibilities that La Ciguapa as a Black feminine figure is exactly a critical fabulation. Here I have tried to tell that impossible story through the rendering and close attention to the context in which she is produced. I want to linger in that thought, not only because of the limited possibilities that the historical archive allows us, but to understand the re-narration of that archive through the work of the artists and writers that I discussed in the chapter, but particularly here, Fidel Báez. Why is it that these Black Dominican women of the diaspora give us back La Ciguapa as an empowering, non-threatening, at least not to us, divine figure? What has La Ciguapa whispered in their ears through the limits of the archive? What secrets has she shared with them from the many portals and hypnotism she has opened and created? What happens when we press our ear against the primary documents and context in which La Ciguapa emerges? What do we hear? If La Ciguapa is an agentic subject within her own narrative, what is she trying to teach us through this fabula? I follow Hartman's move in that, and I quote, I have attempted to jeopardize the status of the event, to displace the received or authorized account, and to imagine what might have happened or might have been said or might have been done, end quote. Jeopardizing Guridi's story of La Ciguapa, given its social historical context, allows us to center the haunting power and presence of Black women in the Caribbean and its diaspora. I build on the work of critical fabulation, which requires us to, and I quote, laboring to paint as a full picture of the lives of the captives as possible, straining against the limits of the archive to write a cultural history of the captive, and at the same time enacting the impossibility of representing the lives of the captives precisely through the process of narration, end quote. This is the framework in which Báez's work operates and the spirit in which my book moves. My book, one day it'll come out, pushes against the limitation of what is traditionally considered an archive and centers the body, memory, and narrative as a site of knowledge production. It is through La Ciguapa's portal that we enter into the trance and are able to see what I call transformation as a theory that, emerges out of these archives. The trance is a space that creates locations for Black Dominican women to reclaim their own stories, to challenge and to push to be seen. Many of the works analyzed in my book are fictional, but they are based in the everyday archives of Black Dominicanas living in the diaspora. Critical fabulations linger in the trance that creates space and instances of possibility, freedom, and multiple belongings. This is what Fidelia Báez makes visible when she critically fabulates La Ciguapa's story and her unboundedness, our unboundedness. Here I show a few images of Báez's work. I believe that her work makes us think of the relationship between land and body, bringing to the fore the horrible experimentations done to people and nature outside of Europe. There are echoes of this in La Ciguapa. Báez reclaims and recreates La Ciguapa, and in an interview with Dominican-American writer Angie Cruz, she says, and I quote, "It's more of the body as a specimen that can be explored in order to reveal something of the viewer in the process. Any of my Ciguapa paintings would be an example of this. They're usually very physical, heavy, seeming figures that fuse with landscape," end quote. In this way, she flips the gaze that originally produced La Ciguapa on its head. La Ciguapa challenges us through her gaze, even when without eyes. Her body's gestures are subversive. They ask no permission and move without apology. Their bodies stare back at the viewer who questions her form. Báez's Ciguapas reveal something of the viewer, the one gazing at her. What is Ciguapa revealing of us? Which then leads me to ask, what does looking at the body as archive tell us about us, the viewer, the researcher, the archiver? These are pivotal questions for us as scholars, especially as something I'm thinking about as I'm doing this project. Saidiya Hartman's critical fabulations in the archive are central to the approach that is, right, La Ciguapa for many of these artists and writers. These writers and writers recreate, they reinterpret, rewrite, and critically fabulate what it means to think of La Ciguapa from their perspectives as Black Dominicanas of the transnational RD. When describing her figures, Báez states, and I quote, "If the figure has a ground, then it is more about creating this void or space that diffuses the weight of the body. The surrounding color voids all that physicality and gets closer to spirit for me, to a psychological interiority. These near abstractions act like rose arcs where the viewer projects themselves onto the picture," end quote. Which pushes me to ask myself, how do I project myself onto these pictures and paintings? What is Báez doing in allowing us to do that? In a sense, La Ciguapa stands at the portal of the trance. We, the viewers, are on the other side of the portal, while she is between our worlds and another. While she is between our world and another, she's there at the portal, prying it open, or sometimes holding it open into the trance. La Ciguapa creates trance through the opening of these portals, and the trance challenges us to alter time and create a space of marronage and escape. Ciguapa opens that figurative portal of trance, transnational migration, the transgressiveness of the forest, and trance as an escape and marginal or liminal space where the creation of a new subjectivity also makes knowledge production and transmission of that knowledge to happen. Right, and in conclusion, right, some of the things that I'm thinking about here are more deeply about marronage and what is there, right, which are things that I believe Báez's work inspires us to ask. And I end with this quote from an interview that she had with Jasmine Hernandez, who's an Afro-Latina art critic. So this particular interview of Báez offers so much insight on these Ciguapas who are linguistic and visual antonyms navigating marronage fugitivity. The discourses of marronage exist in La Ciguapa as she molds and remolds time and space around her. She is an Afrofuturistic figure who creates alternate pasts and potential futures. To conclude, this makes me think of the marronage present in the relationship between my father and I, the marronage from the prison industrial complex that still haunts every corner of our relating. Being in prison for 20 years and re-entry have molded the ups and downs of our father-daughter relationship. What does it mean for us to finally get to a place where we can relate? Where do we put down the assumptions that we know each other? That we operate from that place, it's best that we operate from that place that we do not understand each other, from a linguistic affective grammar of antonyms. What would it mean for us to step into a space where we see each other as human first in a Sylvia Winteresque way? How do we reassess and reassemble into each other's lives after such a racialized time gap? How does Ciguapa, as an abolitionist metaphor and praxis that resists and undoes all kinds of enclosure, exists in the encounter and making of marronage in the face of empire, capitalism, and the prison industrial complex? What happens when in marronage, people like my father re-enter community, but also re-enter kinship? So I'm gonna check the chat because I don't know if I have time for my poem. I think I may be up on time.
Yeah, I think we've got to move on to questions. We've only got 10.
Yes, so I'm gonna pause there. Thank you.
Thank you so much to our wonderful panelists. So we're going to jump into questions. I have two here. We have only about 10 minutes. So let's just go ahead and jump right in. This question came in during Dr. Spears-Rico's talk, but it is a question I think that not only she can answer. And the question was about what does Afro-American mean and what do Afro-descendants mean? And maybe that can open up a larger discussion too about labels, right? And why they matter and where and how we apply them. But just to be clear, the question was specifically, why are they classified as Afro-American? And I think that this was during, just to give context, Dr. Spears-Rico, when you were talking about Afro-Mexican presence, historically.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I'm the best person to answer this particular question. I'm going with the way that Afro-Mexicanos have been identifying themselves now that Mexicanas have been fighting for more visibility and have been, really pushing against the state, against erasure, and identifying themselves as Afro-Mexicans. Afro-descendant, I use that because it's a term more widely used in Latin American studies, as I understand from LASA, from Latin American Studies Association, just to kind of, be like a pan label that describes descendencia Africana in the Americas overall. But I'm happy to engage, with other scholars at this conference to think more critically about using those labels.
Okay, I'm going to jump into the next question, although certainly, we can come back to this if time allows. Joy Sanchez-Taylor asks about movement. And she says, she's asking if panelists can discuss how movement, particularly for Latinx, Latin American, and Afro-Latina women, is related to the ways that Latinx culture makes women with agency monstrous, traitor, or othered.
I don't really know the answer to the question, but I'm going to think out loud because I think there is something patriarchal about that women are not supposed to leave certain spaces, right? I think it goes back to the idea of enclosure, right? That women, right? Just the general ideas that women are supposed to be in the house, that women are supposed to be in certain spaces, right? And that there is like this movement, whether it's movement through land, right? Like migration or moving from one space to another as women without men or without other people, that is seen as negative, right? As you're betraying your family, or you're betraying the community if you're leaving or if you're moving, right? Even in migration, right? And even, yeah, so that's, I think there's that tied to it, right? Where women are seen as just staying in the domestic space, or staying in the community space, or staying in a particular, right, enclosed, that the moment that there's a movement that happens, there's, right, because they're breaking with they're really breaking with patriarchy, right? And these kind of really traditionally gendered norms.
I'd love to address this question with thinking critically about La Malinche, and thinking about how Malinchismo and, reproducing La Malinche as La Chingada, or the raped one, and how that hasn't left us, in a Mexican national identity. We still have this colonial, like, gendered violent stereotype, all, hundreds of years later. Once, women have sex, being considered traitors, because of that. Once they are, figures in the public sphere, like she became a figure in the public sphere that the Aztec Empire had to contend with, that women were not, doing like as much negotiating or diplomacy, and she was a diplomat. And then once she actually had sex with Hernan Cortés, whatever kind of agency we want to accord to that particular very unequal dynamic, power dynamic, between them, then she becomes like the mother of the race, but then she also becomes, over and over again, La Chingada. And we see that, and we see how this is, applied in the Chicano movement as well. When Chicana feminists or Chicanas want to talk about, access to birth control, domestic violence, and how those issues are not being addressed within the Chicano movement. And then they get called traitors, and they get called Malinches, and are told, go join the women's movement, because that's where they discuss those issues. We're talking about Chicano liberation, and this is, that's what this space is for. So it doesn't include, issues of the body. And I think that, we've thought about it in Chicana feminism as what it means to be, as Omaris was speaking about, like in the private sphere versus the public sphere. Like once a woman is in the public sphere, we become sexualized, we become, in the virgin whore dichotomy, we become the whores, for being leaders, for being thinkers, etc. I myself deal with this as an Indigenous feminist intellectual as well. We can think about the feminicides in Juarez, for example, and how, women were being blamed for their own deaths because they were seen as, bodies that were out in the public, working in maquiladoras. And so then it was their fault for exposing themselves. So it just, this, I agree with Omaris, that this happens over and over again, in terms of, when women transgress these boundaries, we're still dealing with the virgin whore dichotomy in a major way within Latinidad, even as we've tried to push against that and to complicate it.
I think I'll jump in, and I'll also add, just to agree with Gabriela and Omaris, that right, it has a lot to do with like patriarchy in Latin communities, but it also has, like, not all women are experience the same form or the same level of like othering, monstrosity, or like treacherous, right? That like mestizas, white passing Latinas, like do not experience the same otherness, right, as Indigenous and Black women. So I think, right, that privilege also needs to be considered about who is being silenced when we talked about, right, who is being silenced. So yeah.
I think that, the sort of major theme that we have happening in this panel is really pushing to think about who has been invisible within Latina, Latino, Latinx studies. And we've focused specifically in this panel on children, thinking about them as important subjects, and of course, thinking about Black and Indigenous perspectives and peoples that have been really written out of not just Latin American history, but thinking about US, Latino history. So I'm curious to know, as we end, since we don't have much time, if all of you might quickly comment on what you would like to see in the future of Latina, Latino studies. We labeled this panel's labeled new and future directions, although I would say I don't necessarily think that they're new. I think that what you're forcing the field to reckon with, and it might be right in terms of it actually being in writing, but these are issues that have very, very long histories. So I'm wondering though, what each of you would like to see in the future of Latina, Latino, Latinx studies.
I would like to see just a more, like, I love this panel because we all had very critical lenses of how we go into our work. And I would love to continue seeing more critical lenses on conversations and scholarship around race in Latino studies, or Latino studies dealing with that more so, because I don't think that the Black, Indigenous folks in Latino studies, like, we need white Latinos to do the work too, right? We need to talk more about that critically, and for scholarship to continue to do that and to bring it to the forefront, because I think that is something that I'd like to see more of, right? Because we can't just carry all of it.
I would love to see us speaking more across the board. Afro-Latinidades in conversation with critical Latinx indigeneities. That would be like a dream, conference or seminar of mine, because of these critiques of Mestizaje are coming from this very critical and important scholarship that I think benefits it's fecund for these conversations, to make these interventions in Latina, Latino, Latinx studies and in Latin American studies.
Okay, we've run out of time. Sonia, I do want to point to Sonia wrote something in the chat box, also relevant to this question. So please check that out. But I'm going to close because I know that we have other programming coming up. But thank you to everyone who joined us today. And this was a lovely conversation. And I believe, and Joy, feel free to jump in, that the questions, right, are being recorded and may be addressed at some later point.
Yeah, any questions we didn't get to, we'll record and we'll try to answer later, either in the chat or in any of the future presentations for today. And I just want to say thank you to all the panelists and to Jillian for doing such an amazing job moderating. And then I'm going to turn it over back to Hugo, because I think we're moving into the lunch hour, which includes music and the showing of a really cool documentary.
Thank you, Joy, and thanks to all our panelists. Thank you, Jillian. Amazing presentations and a lot to think about.